Nearly 2 years ago, on March 17, 2011, the Security Council took one of the most important decisions in its 66 years of existence. In Resolution 1973, that's the jargon we use when we don't want to describe the formal title of a resolution, which is quite often quite long. So in this Resolution 1973, they numbered simply one by one, of course, starting in 1945. The Security Council clearly and unequivocally reaffirmed the international community's determination to fulfill its responsibility to protect the civilian population in Libya from the violence against them by their own government. It also authorized the use of all necessary means in order to protect civilians and civilian populated areas. And when the Security Council refers to all necessary means, that also includes military action. In contrast, the UN Security Council has hardly been able to act with regard to Syria since May 2011. Syria is clearly an R2P situation in our view, and Mr. Chairman, you already mentioned some figures. Yesterday, Valerie Amos, who was the head of the humanitarian part of the UN, she gave us some new figures which are even more disconcerting. 70,000 deaths, we mentioned 60,000, the numbers keep on rising and quickly. 4 million people in need, including 2 million internally displaced, and nearly 1,936,000 registered refugees in neighboring countries. But various attempts to adopt a resolution in the Security Council stranded on vetoes by Russia and China, as you also mentioned. So there's a stark difference here between the international community's reaction to the crisis in Libya and the decisive action it took there, and its inaction in terms of the Security Council concerning Syria. So I'm therefore pleased that the Peace Island Institutes and the Global Affairs Center invited me to contribute to the discussion today and giving our view on the R2P and its application in practice. Now, the direct reason for the development of the new principle of responsibility to protect, which is then shortened to an R2P, were two tragedies in which the international community did not act. The genocide in Rwanda of 1994 and the mass slaughter of Bosnian civilians in Srebrenica in 1995. And it's no coincidence that the group of friends of R2P in the UN, that's a group of countries and ambassadors who want to support the notion of R2P and its implementation, that the two co-chairs of that group are Rwanda and the Netherlands, because these two cases, the genocide in Rwanda and the mass slaughter in Srebrenica, were the starting point, I think, of the discussion which led to R2P. An international discussion started after those two tragedies about, first of all, what was then called humanitarian intervention. And this was not an esoteric debate about theoretical concepts, because in 1990 already, the failure of the Security Council to authorize strong measures to hold the Serbian government's violence against the Albanian population in Kosovo led to the decision of NATO to start a military campaign even without the Security Council mandate. And after 3 months of aerial bombardment, Belgrade was forced to give up control of Kosovo. Now, the international community was deeply divided about this. A group of countries taking it upon themselves without a security mandate to attack a member state of the UN for a political purpose, which was perhaps by itself very laudatory, but was this not very much against international laws? It's not an illegal operation. So in the debate, it started with Rwanda and Srebrenica. An impetus was given by the events in Kosovo, NATO's operation in Kosovo. But at the same time, there was an increased feeling that there needed to be a sound legal basis for such interventions as had been taking place in Kosovo. And there was therefore there needed to be a bridge between the moral imperative to prevent or put an end to mass atrocities and the principle of legality. And the Canadian government established an International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, as it was called, which came up with the principle of responsibility to protect, to bridge those two elements, as I said. And this was adopted by the UN's General Assembly in 2005 at the so-called World Summit, which took place that year and was adopted at a very high level of heads of state and government in the outcome document of that World Summit. The text of the two paragraphs in that declaration on R2P were very carefully drafted and subject of long, detailed negotiations. It limited the international community's focus on R2P to 4 specific types of mass atrocities. So not just any humanitarian crisis or any major violence against human rights. It had to be either genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, or crimes against humanity. Those were the 4 categories. And this focus on the 4 crimes is often described as narrow, but at the same time deep. Narrow because it only applies to these extreme circumstances of those 4 mass atrocities and not to any humanitarian emergency. But why deep? The text of the World Summit in paragraph 138 makes clear that the responsibility to protect populations against those 4 mass atrocities lies first of all with the government of the individual state itself. And it calls upon the international community to encourage and help states to exercise this responsibility. So that's where the first and main responsibility still remains with the government of the country concerned. And then the question is, what do you do if the government does not exercise that responsibility, or when you even have a situation when the government attacks its own population, as we saw in Kosovo? And therefore, in the following paragraph in the World Summit document, the responsibility was recognized of the international community through the United Nations to help protect populations should national authorities manifestly fail to protect their own populations against these 4 crimes. And it also added that this can mean taking collective action in a timely and decisive manner through the Security Council on the basis of Chapter 7 of the Charter. Chapter 7 means potentially not only, but potentially it includes military action. But this is a very fundamental decision, very fundamental notion. The United Nations could mandate a member state or a group of member states to attack another member state, not because that other member state has attacked the countries who were taking military action, but because that member state which was being attacked militarily attacked its own population. So a very fundamental concept here, which was developed, and somewhat surprisingly even was embraced by the heads of state and government at that time. I think Professor Dwyer will go a little bit more in detail about the developments too, I think. So I won't give all the details which are also involved, which you know much better than I do. So what happened was that the international community gave a decisive role to the Security Council in the decision-making with regard to these collective actions in R2P situation. So the Security Council, as you know perhaps, is not an institution in the end which is without its criticism. There is a long debate going on which has not led to any results until now, but still about reform of the Security Council, enlarging it. But in the end, the member states all accepted the central role of the Council. However, some suggestions in the report of the Commission which the Canadians set up, some suggestions to address some of the criticisms of the way the Security Council works, by, for instance, establishing criteria for military intervention, and not leave it simply to the opinion of the P5 and the other members of the Security Council. That was not included in the decision. Neither the idea, which for instance the Netherlands also supported very much, asking the members of the Security Council, the permanent members, to refrain from using their veto power in the case of mass atrocities. Again, that was an element which was not included, and of course now in the case of Syria, one sees the consequences of that. But I want to stress, and that's a very important point to remember, that responsibility to protect is much more than military intervention. The Secretary General in different reports elaborated on how to implement and make concrete the responsibility to protect, and he defined 3 pillars in those reports. First of all, this major point of the responsibility of the state itself to protect its own population. Secondly, if the state cannot do that, but would like to do that, but doesn't have the capacities, there is a responsibility for the international community to provide assistance and help, for instance, in capacity building, so that states can exercise this responsibility. And then pillar 3 that's only the third one, there is a responsibility of the international community to take timely and decisive measures when the government cannot or will not do what is necessary to protect its subpopulation. And then, as this idea was further elaborated, more and more elements were identified as possible means for the international community to put pressure on the government concerned to do what was necessary. Not just military action, but fact-finding, suspension from international organizations, arms embargoes, targeted sanctions, and then as a last resort, military action. So even Pillar 3 is much more than military intervention, but military measures are the most sensitive. The UN authorizing military measures, like I said, against one of its own members because of the way that the government treats its own population. The Netherlands see responsibility to protect as an emerging norm, as one of the most important recent developments in international relations, together with the establishment of the International Criminal Court. R2P, in our view, is a fundamental shift in the doctrine of sovereignty, which for long-term governed the relations between states. It reflects the growing acceptance of the doctrine which places the state at the service of the individual citizen. Sovereignty as a responsibility, in the term coined by scholars and practitioners like Francis Deng and Roberta Cohen. And let's not forget that even in the past, sovereignty has rarely been regarded as entirely unqualified. Just like the doctrine of sovereignty of states, the doctrine of sovereignty as a responsibility has a long history. And I'm saying that because I'm from the Netherlands, and in the Act of Abjuration, which was signed in The Hague in 1581, and which was a kind of declaration of independence in the revolt of the Netherlands against the Spanish king, the King of Spain, who was then ruler of the Netherlands, it was stated that God did not create the subjects for the benefit of the prince, but rather the prince for the sake of the subjects, without whom he would not be a prince. To govern them justly and wisely, to support and love them as a shepherd his flock and a father does his children, and even to protect them at the risk of his own life and limb. The crucial part here is I think, without whom, without the subjects, the prince would not be a prince. So if he mistreats his subjects, he loses his right to be a prince. 400 years later, United Secretary General Kofi Annan defended this idea in a speech in which he pointed out that the old orthodoxy of state sovereignty was never absolute. After all, he said, the Charter was issued in the name of the peoples, not the government of the United Nations. Its aim is not only to preserve international peace, vitally important though that is, but also to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. The Charter protects the sovereignty of peoples. It was never meant as a license for governments to trample on human rights and human dignity. Sovereignty implies responsibility, not just power. End of quote. So R2P is therefore not really that new. The core underlying idea that states have an obligation to protect men and women from the worst atrocities is well established. Basic human rights principles were adopted in the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and there is by now a substantial body of international human rights law. The United Nations adopted the Convention of Genocide already in 1948, which stated that persons committing genocide shall be punished, whether they are constitutionally responsible rulers, public officials, or private individuals. And the protection of civilians during armed conflict is well established in international humanitarian law. What happened with the advent of R2P was that the international community accepted for the first time its collective responsibility to take action, and if necessary, even military action, should states fail to protect citizens from genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So R2P imposes two obligations. The first one upon the state individually, and its government in particular, of course, and the second on the international community of states, collectively. With the embrace of the responsibility to protect, a long and unresolved debate over whether to act instead became a discussion about how and when to act. And that leads me to the issue of the application of R2P. So, well, the situation of Syria makes clear that a discussion on how and when to act is not necessarily easier than whether to act at all. That last thing took about a decade between the genocide in Rwanda and the adoption of the World Summit document in 2005. On the application, we only have a limited number of years, so it's too early perhaps to draw a conclusion. But it is clear that there are, in many different cases, different roads were taken, sometimes successfully, sometimes less successfully. But Syria is now on the agenda of the Council, and the debates continue on how to act and which measures to adopt. Deep divisions, however, have prevented the Council until now to take decisive action. There are other examples, however, where R2P has been applied and successfully, especially in less known situations, for example, Guinea and Kenya, next to Libya. But for the sake of time, I think I'll perhaps speak a bit longer than I should. Professor, would you be mentioning Kenya and Guinea too? So I'll skip that part of my remarks. We'll say this about 2 or 3 pages. And go on to Libya. Now, Libya, in 2 years ago, protests that began in the capital of Tripoli spread within weeks across the country to the city of Benghazi, which became the opposition's stronghold. And was soon subject to shocking brutality as Gaddafi dispatched his national army to crush the unrest. Now, the Libyan leader expressed clear intent to continue committing massive human rights violations by announcing to Benghazi residents that his forces would show no mercy to rebels. And he later used language reminiscent of the genocide in Rwanda when he talked about protesting citizens of his own country as cockroaches, and that he would cleanse Libya house by house until all protesters had surrendered. Now, faced with these statements and with the behavior of Gaddafi's military and militias, which to the mind of the majority of the members of the Security Council amounted to an imminent intention to massacre the city's population, the Security Council decided to take action. By the way, I should mention that the Arab League played an important part by setting the stage for international action by calling for measures of the Security Council. So on the 26th of February 2011, the Security Council adopted Resolution 1970. Adopted by consensus, no opposition, no abstentions, and it affirmed the government of Libya's responsibility to protest, and it called for a ceasefire and for steps to fulfill the legitimate demands of the population. It also referred the situation to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and it imposed an arms embargo, travel ban, and an asset freeze. I mention these elements specifically because they make the point that R2P is more than military action. There are lots of other elements you can bring into the game to exercise pressure. However, what became clear in Libya that there was such a drive behind Colonel Gaddafi's military operations that these measures agreed upon would take time, and they would have an effect which was too late, so to speak. So a further decision was taken in 1973, which authorized the use of military force. It was a very general decision, like I said, all necessary measures. It was not the UN itself that was going to do this, because the UN has no capacity to organize and lead a large-scale military operation. Basically, there are only 2 structures in the world who can do that at the moment. That's the Pentagon and NATO. The Pentagon would be a bit perhaps too American, so it came to NATO to do it. And in the end, with success. Still, there is the exercise of the implementation of Resolution 1973 led to a fierce debate within the UN. Is this now R2P? Is this what we meant when we took this decision in 2005? Is this really overthrowing a government, regime change? if we say protection of civilians, can that lead to full-scale military operations which are more than simply protecting civilians who are under threat? I won't go into that specific debate now for the moment. Just to say simply, if, in our view, if the Security Council says all necessary means, it says all necessary means. It doesn't say some necessary means are only a part of what is necessary. It said all. So I don't really understand some of the criticism that NATO went too far and misinterpreted the mandate it was given. But it was a shock for many governments that indeed Gaddafi was not only overturned, but even murdered while he was trying to escape. So, but it did clearly have an effect on the debate in Syria, and I'll turn to that now. Now, like I said earlier, the Syria situation is clearly an R2P situation. In our view, the regime is the one who shoot out also some of the opposing voices and forces, committing crimes against humanity according to the various reports of the Commission of Inquiry established by the Human Rights Council. And we can see it on the news on a daily basis. Senior UN leadership, including the Secretary General, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the UN Special Advisors on the Prevention of Genocide and on R2P, have called the situation in Syria an R2P situation. Let me not go into the details of why they are saying this, to save them some time. So first of all, we have these large numbers of people being killed, refugees, and so on. And secondly, there's a clarity among at least all major people in the UN and many governments, members of the UN, that the government of Syria is manifestly failing in its responsibility to protect its population. But no action has been possible until now on the basis of the 2005 decision of the World Summit, only because of the three vetoes which have been applied by Russia and supported by China against any kind of active involvement in this crisis in Syria, which goes further than supporting a political process by the efforts of Mr. Annan and Mr. Brahimi. The argument one hears, sometimes also from those countries I mentioned, against taking further steps by the Security Council, is that such decisions, resolutions which would authorize stronger measures would mean foreign intervention, and that foreign intervention would only lead to chaos. I think if one looks at the situation at the moment, the situation is chaos. Could be hardly worse, and we're not talking not because of foreign intervention, but because that would be my argument, the lack of foreign intervention. If the international community would have gotten involved earlier on, it perhaps would have applied pressure on the Syrian government, it perhaps could have pushed the Syrian government in a much more moderate position and into a dialogue with the opposition. But the fact that they felt that they could win the war, so to speak, being supported by countries who provide them with arms, and being the regime that they are, there was no possibility of any kind of peaceful dialogue developing, and then after a couple of months of peaceful demonstrations, this turned into an armed rebellion. So in other words, the scenario of chaos that some countries predicted if the UN would have been taking action along the lines of the resolutions which it adopted in Libya, that scenario has now become a reality due to its inaction. And that reminds us that both action and inaction entail costs, risks and costs. Because the lesson of Libya is that people said, yeah, but we took this decision, but look at all these unintended consequences. And our argument is look at Syria, and if you don't do anything, look at them at the consequences. Both courses have their risks and consequences. For instance, the Security Council could have adopted a resolution authorizing a weapons embargo, asset freeze, and other sanctions. And that would by no means, in our view, lead automatically to military intervention. Any further step would need to have a mandate by the Security Council, including the agreement, at least non-use of the veto power by Russia and China. So this argument that once you take a small step, you end up by you're going down all the road, all the way to military intervention, that is simply not true. The Russians, the Chinese, the majority in the Security Council can always block any further action taken by the Security Council after they would have taken these decisions on more limited measures like the weapons embargo, asset freeze, and so on. Moreover, if you would think this argument through, it would mean that in any situation, unless you decided from the beginning that you would have military intervention, you cannot do anything. Because the moment you start doing something, you end up with military intervention. And this is simply be on record, I think. Yeah? So I wanted to say bullshit, but I won't say. Now I'm coming to my last couple of remarks. One of the effects is of the inaction of the Security Council and willingness by some of its members to use serious pressure to achieve a political solution. There is an increasing call for military action outside of the UN, outside of the Security Council. Should we not do anything? Should we accept that the Russians and the Chinese are blocking this? Their answer is, can such a thing happen on the basis of R2P? And then the answer is no, it cannot. Because R2P, as an essential element I mentioned in the beginning, has this necessary legal basis through a resolution of the Security Council. It's part of the concept that you would have that mandate. So military intervention could be, people could come to the conclusions themselves, governments could come to the conclusion themselves that something needed to be done, although, by the way, I don't see that happening quickly at the moment. But even if they would come to that conclusion, that it would not be on the basis of R2P, it would be more on another, either legal basis or another way of thinking. The reason I'm making that point is that R2P is a major advance in international development of the international norm and international legal institutions and the rule of law internationally. We should not abuse it by applying it to situations where not all the conditions are met for its use. Perhaps, like I said, action can still be taken on other grounds, but don't use R2P for that. It's too precious to abuse it, I would think. So for Syria, for the moment, we need to continue to work along political tracks. Perhaps with resolutions including the elements I mentioned, asset freeze, weapons embargo, and all that. No, it's just shorten this. No, in the end I realize it is a bit, perhaps people would say it's very pragmatic. It's what I'm saying, that we have to, unless somebody decides to go into military action on its own, the only alternative we have for the moment is to go for a unified international approach to find a solution through the political track, providing at the same time humanitarian aid, support the opposition in those negotiations, and perhaps also in other ways, engaging with Mr. Brahimi. I know this is highly unsatisfactory. It's not a short-term answer to the problem. But the commitment to the R2P and the reasoning behind it is, unfortunately, one must conclude, not strong enough at the moment in some countries to take the necessary decisive action, notwithstanding their signature under the 2005 outcome document. Thank you for your attention.